Hi, my name is John Brink. Thank you for joining us. You are watching History of the BC Forest Industry. My name is John Brink. Thank you for joining History of the BC Forest Industry. Today's guest is Rob Schuetz. Good morning, Rob. He's the president of the Industrial Forestry Services in Prince George. He's also an RPF, a registered professional forester. And tell us a little bit about you, Rob.
Thanks for having me, John. I came to Prince George back in 1988, initially from London, Ontario, and I got my Bachelor of Forestry degree at University of Toronto. Worked a few years in Northern Ontario in logging operations with Domtar, and then came out to BC in, I think it was about October 1988. Showed up at Lakelands Mills. Back in those days, you come into Prince George and it was a sea of sawmills and pulp mills and that. And they directed me to Industrial Forestry Service, and at that time there wasn't much in the way of full-time jobs in forestry, so they offered me a job shortly thereafter, full-time, and I've been there ever since. Took over after about just over 20 years as president of IFS.
And what do they do? They are a consulting firm, or?
Yeah, about a little over 50% of the work we do is forest consulting. For that, it's mostly multi-phase timber. The layout of the cut blocks prior to harvesting, and we have people engaged in silviculture. We've never done any tree planting, but coming up with silviculture plans, doing timber supply analysis, doing research and development. A little bit now into agricultural opportunities, and then the other 50% of the company, we have a seedling nursery in just outside of Prince George that is we produce about 20 million forest seedlings per year, and those are just seedlings that are purchased by the forest industry for replanting.
Yeah. And the firm has been there for a long time.
Yeah, 1952 it was started. 1952. Larry DeGray started it back then, and we've been working steadily ever since then.
Yeah, and then one fellow that I always relate to with IFS is Harry Garens.
Yeah.
That was there for a long time,
yeah,
too.
Harry retired in '93, but he still shows up to our Christmas parties. Yeah. And the young guys really find his talks. He usually gives a little bit of a presentation, fascinating. What was the forestry and what was timber cruising like in the 1950s and
exactly.
and early '60s when they had Volkswagen Bugs in the forest, and it was
So how many people does IFS employ?
We do about 130 full-time equivalents. A lot of temporaries at the nursery, a lot of summer students, just for field workers. It's a really good training ground for university students. Exactly. Who coming out of school, they want to get their their field experience, and we've got probably close to 25 people who have been with us for over 20 years, and a few as long as 40 years.
Wow. And then the area of where you work with the industry or government or whoever, is that limited to BC or the northern interior?
No, we have a branch office in Dawson Creek. Right. We have a branch office in Vancouver. The guys there, it's just on the software end. We provide this cruise comp software for that the industry uses to evaluate how much volume is in their cut blocks. But we do it right from coast, from the entire province. Not so much on the layout, but just providing different products and services across the province.
Wow, so you're quite involved right throughout the industry. One of the things that you mentioned, a cut block, that is an area designated where a company can harvest logs?
Yeah, a cut block is just typically or historically it's been about 60 hectare to 100 hectare area. A forest company gets the rights to harvest in that through a cutting permit, the rights to harvest within that area. But before they do that, they have to have a boundary laid out. They have to have the timber cruised. riparian areas have to be flagged, so that they're protected. There's a lot of assessments done both for the types of soil that's in those cut blocks so that they know what types of trees to replant. Silviculture permits, maps. There's a lot of work has to be done prior to a company going into harvest.
So it's all very structured, right?
Yeah.
Under the, it's not somebody goes out there with a power saw and starts cutting trees.
No.
The whole process of having the privilege of access to tenure is very structured. From volume to area to cut blocks, all of that, and then the replanting, and all those things are very, very
it's
managed.
extremely structured, and we've had in various situations, both First Nations and people that were not as closely involved in forest or forest development, participate in the layout process with us, and they were, for the most part, they were amazed at the level of kind of bureaucracy, but also effort that goes into developing an area prior to harvesting.
Yeah, one of the things that I find so encouraging that that we are good stewards of our resources here in the province of British Columbia. I believe, and obviously we can maybe do more, but the other part that I find exciting about it is that First Nations is more and more involved in becoming, partners in the forest industry and what it looks like in terms of not only the land base, but also in terms of where we are in producing and production and as tenure holders. And hopefully from here on in much further.
Yeah, and part of that I think is just the growth of the University of Northern British Columbia. They got a forestry department. We're getting their graduates, some of them First Nations, and we've hired them occasionally. They get their bush legs under them, and then they go on to becoming managers within their bands and have considerable input and provide a considerable direction on how the forest will be managed, that both licensees and government have to take into account prior to harvesting activities.
Yeah, you see, I always kind of look at it, like we have this amazing resource, and then, in terms of the, in the timber resource, but then also in all the other natural things that we have in this beautiful province. But then we have, the University of Northern British Columbia, and together with the College of New Caledonia, and the programs that they have either for skills development or future research. And later on in the show we'll talk a little bit more about a potential for a center of excellence in addition to all of that. Now with the IFS and the consultants that you have and the people that you have, that you also would be involved with government and potentially we see more of hydro being produced or bioenergy being produced.
So we got involved with that a lot more, and on a personal level, I started off with Industrial Forestry Service, like I said, in '88, a bunch of years in the field initially, and then that kind of evolved into a lot more timber supply analysis, where we were determining mathematically using models what the annual allowable cut would be. And then, about 2007, the provincial government came out with their clean energy plan, and that was a plan that really was the Liberal government's response to how do we deal with the mountain pine beetle epidemic and this huge volume of dead wood that existed out there. And so it was, and as a result of that plan, the government directed BC Hydro to offer opportunities for energy producers to produce clean energy.
Yes, to build infrastructure.
Yeah.
And then the question is that if you want investors to build infrastructure, they have to have reasonable expectation of access to fiber that goes into.
Yeah, it was, and so BC Hydro contacted us, and we ended up doing the due diligence for every one of those, under a phase 1 call for power, a phase 2 call. There was an integrated power offer, a community-based power. Producers had all opportunities to propose plans for infrastructure, for development. And BC Hydro, for the most part, it was is there the volume there for them? Do they have a reasonable biomass or bioenergy plan? Do they have access to fiber? And the other, if they were awarded an what's it called, electricity purchase agreement, would doing so impact other consumers of the biomass? And so we looked at all of those criteria. It wasn't necessarily followed by
No.
the government, but it was looked at.
So then, looking at today, as we hear about all the difficulties in the industry, and we see mills not only temporarily closing but being shut because of the reduction in the annual allowable cut that has virtually dropped by half in the interior from the high that it was during the uplift period. It mainly directly relating to the pine beetle pandemic, and then before we had something similar to that, but in a smaller form, where we had the spruce beetle pandemic in the Bowen region, that then was referred to as one of the largest clear cuts, that even the astronauts from the sky could see it, but that was dwarfed by what happened to the pine beetle. Tell us a little bit about the beetles, and is there a link to global warming? Because the same, not necessarily exactly the same, but if I look at Northern Europe, Sweden, Finland, and Germany, they have had similar issues with pine beetle or with beetles.
Yeah.
With beetles, and how do you see that in terms of connection to global warming and others?
So the mountain pine beetle epidemic started in the BC area, late 1990s. The government response was to increase the harvest level, and so there's a lot of the mills ramped up, and never completely utilized the entire AAC, but a lot of mills started producing a little bit more. One of the consequences was it was cheap stumpage, cheap logs, relatively inexpensive areas to log because the mountain pine beetle is in flatter ground. At the time, initially government was waiting for a cold weather event to happen. That's what kind of killed the beetle back in the late 1980s, when they had a minus 40 event in 1987 that killed the beetle epidemic in the Chilcotin at that time.
And they have to have it early in the year, in October before the snow falls.
Yeah. That never happened, and and we waited and waited, and so as a consequence, we lost probably about 56% of the merchantable pine trees in the interior. Initially when it happened, everybody was thinking, okay, we could use these pine trees for 5-6 years. Ends up we've been using them for about 15 years, and the reason that we've been able to use them a lot longer is that they're have a very long taproot that keeps the trees standing long after they're dead. Typically 15, 16, 18 years. We don't get that with the spruce beetle.
No.
The spruce doesn't have the taproot. A lot of times, even after you've removed the pine, you'll have green spruce trees falling down because they're so shallow rooted. So now you have a spruce beetle epidemic similar to the Bowron, but actually even in larger size, hitting the areas east of Prince George. And so it's not so much that maybe their shelf life wouldn't be so as long. It's the fact that as shallow-rooted species that are a lot more susceptible to stronger winds, they're going to fall over faster, and the shelf life for those stems will be quite a bit less
Because it's on the ground.
because it's on the ground.
Yeah.
So global warming, it's probably had a impact. It's also the fires. We've done a pretty good job over the last century in fire protection.
Too good?
Well, prior to the mountain pine beetle, we had probably more mature forest than we'd ever had in the past, simply because of protection and which resulted in an age class distribution for the pine that had to be corrected, from a Mother Nature perspective, and we weren't harvesting to balance that out. So, you could say that, and some people have, that the beetle is Mother Nature correcting, for lack of harvesting and maybe lack and excessive fire control, both of which aren't bad things.
Yeah, because fires would be a natural way of restoring the forest,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And we become so efficient in it that it resulted in all the trees over mature in some cases, and had an effect on it as well. The result of all of that has been the reduction in AAC that is around the corner, but the other effect has been now all the lower cost timber has been harvested, because what we know or what we hear all the time, that we have become the highest cost producer of lumber from being the lowest cost producer, and we have moved now to the highest cost producer.
Yeah, and so there's a few things in play there. When we were harvesting dead pine, there was lots of it, and so the competition between mills wasn't that great. So the harvesting cost was low. The log costs on the open market was low because there was surpluses of it. And we had a softwood lumber agreement that ended a few years ago with the United States, and now we're 21% duties on that. So when you add together the fact that now we're a lot more competitive on the remaining logs, we're driving, even though the lumber prices are going down, we've been in the last year and a half driving up the cost of logs, the tariff, all of those things added up to us transitioning over the last decade from being the lowest cost producer of lumber in North America to the highest cost producer, and it's going to rationalize itself in the next few years.
But we're still in transition. There may be still some more closures, but and some names on buildings may change, and so it's an industry still very much in transition, isn't it?
Yeah.
And down the coast, although it's different species, and I always say there are two regions really, the coastal or the interior. And if you look at the coast, they have had already for a long time their issues and their problems as well. Similar in terms of the access to fiber and too much capacity and adjusting to new realities of high cost and a market not being able to absorb that.
Yeah. The coast has a whole different set of issues that everything from log exports to a greater population that's a lot more sensitive to logging in their backyard, to high cost logs that especially on the steeper slopes. So we've seen a transition there to harvesting second growth more and more, especially in the southern part of the island. At the same time, the coast has access to the water, which allows them to move logs longer distances
more effectively
and cost effectively. But their costs are significantly higher on the coast. The quality of the logs are quite a bit better, but they're also a slightly different market as well.
Are we good stewards? If I kind of look back in the interior, that I believe in 1987 is when we had a large volume of NSR, not sufficient restocked land in our land base. Have we since that 87, when there was legislation that transferred the responsibility from government to industry, has that been taken care of?
So yeah, in 1987 there was a huge amount of non-satisfactorily restocked areas. Prior to that, government was responsible for reforestation, and then after 87, the forest licensees had that obligation imposed on them. Back then, it was usually about a 7-year regeneration delay. There wasn't a lot of planting, a lot of naturals. We've eliminated all those natural or NSR areas. Our replanting delay now is typically 1 year or even less. And the big thing there is the quality. Like, we had some significant wildfires recently, and the government's done a lot of analysis of what's happened over the last 3 decades with respect to replanting and what their forecasts of growth would be. And what they've found with respect to their timber supply models was that the regrowth of those stands far exceeded what their projections were. And so that offsets a lot of the negative impacts that these fires are having in the midterm, as far as the the midterm harvest level.
So then it becomes, where do we go from here? What will it look like as we go forward? And I believe that one of the things that we have been good stewards, what I'm hearing from you is that we in fact are exceeding expectations in a number of the areas, but at the same time, the industry will look different than it does. I still believe, and I believe you do as well, that there is great future for the forest industry in British Columbia, but it will look different. We have to do more training. We create more skill sets. The skill sets that we need 5-10 years from now are skill sets that we are not even using today. And so a center of excellence that does research and development in northern BC in combination with UNBC and CNC would be something that would be very, very much needed and required.
Yeah, what we see, I think the government has recognized that there's not much they can do to salvage a few more sawmills. What they are concerned about is the fact that there's an industry that utilizes the residual fiber. You have your pulp mills that use wood chips, originally all from sawmills, pellet facilities that use the sawdust and shavings, energy plants that use the hog fuel or the bark off the trees. All of those industries, or all of those mills, initially were created to utilize sawmill residues.
Right.
And now with a reduction in the number of sawmills, you won't have as many residues, so you have to go back in the bush. And can you afford it? And
there's so much fiber left in the bush, right?
Yeah.
So that that we have to find ways and means to utilize and harvest
and
right?
do it economically, so that they can collaborate and work together to get the fiber to
So
the
if
mill.
I can then kind of look back, we are good stewards. We have dealt with the things that we cannot avoid in terms of the pine beetle. We're making adjustments to volume or capacity available to the volume of timber. There are new job opportunities and incremental fiber that is left in the bush, and then making new products for new markets. But in order to do that, we have to create the skill sets and do the research and development, and then again become the industry that everybody envies, and that people come from far and wide to see what we have done, as they have done in Sweden 20-25 years ago when they had the same challenges.
No, I agree. The opportunities here are significant, but it's going to be a lot different with respect to, it's not just sawmill or lumber commodities. It's it's pellets, it's energy, it's continued
secondary
secondary manufacturing,
new products for new markets. And so much to discuss, Rob, and I really appreciate it. I must bring you back at some point because we didn't touch on all the things that I would have liked to touch on, but I very much appreciated having you here today. And thank you for watching A History of the Forest Industry in British Columbia. Again, next week we will have a very exciting guest, so I hope you come and join us again.